Hello and welcome to another edition of Nucleus Investment Insights. We are live again as we are every week on Thursdays at 12:30. This week we've decided to have another go at the Trump presidency, and given all the events and just looking at what it means, that the Trump trade, so to speak, has been front and center in a number of different publications. And so we dealt with this a few months ago, but we thought, given the events the last week, well worth having another look. So Dave, welcome aboard. Just a quick reminder as well before we jump into this is that everything you're going to hear today is general in nature. None of it is personal advice. And so, yeah, if you've got any questions or anything like that, then pop them into the chat. And if you're looking for any personal advice, you can speak to us directly. Dave, welcome aboard.
Thanks, Damo. Nice to be here.
Excellent. So we'll just sort of jump straight into it, I guess. So we dealt with this last time when we spoke. I guess there's some parts around what we wanted to talk about, the betting odds and what's happening there. We'll touch briefly on some of the legal cases, and then sort of talk about what are the policies that we know of. And I guess what are the main factors we're sort of keeping in mind from our perspective as we're looking in this sort of going forward. So I guess the betting odds, Dave, your thoughts on that? It looks like the jaws are obviously opening up, but having said that, I guess Trump's been been this high before in the past a few times.
Well, the assassination stuff is pretty powerful. I suppose it's the icing on the cake, if I could be so bold in terms of positioning Trump as a martyr following.
Oh, absolutely.
All of the lawfare and Jan 6 stuff, and which seems to have been, I don't know whether you'd call it backfired or effective, I don't know, but it certainly is the crowning moment of that, and so that's a very strong sympathetic pull, I guess, for Americans. I mean, we could surmise, and that seems to have been reflected in polls. Having said that, when there was an attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan, his polling went absolutely berserk versus a small bump for Trump. And so it's as an analogy, it's not as strong as it appears if we use that one off from Reagan.
And for my part, I'm sort of like, my thing is, okay, so if you were dead against Trump because you're worried about effects on democracy and being porn stars and all this other stuff like this, it's not going to convince you to vote for him. But it's a question is whether there's some people who it's some of the apathetic centre who are like, I don't know if I want to, I like him better than Biden, but I don't know if I want another 4 years. I probably wouldn't have bothered voting. That might actually turn up.
I do think Americans are more patriotic than Australians, and it buys into that. For good or bad, or good or ill. I think there are pluses and minuses for that for both nations, and clearly Trump is now the favourite. So I don't think we dispute that. That said, what are we? Early July, August, September, October, November. 4 months to go, and an interesting change of Democratic leadership completely shifts the race again, especially if it's someone young, I think. And all of this attack on Biden gets reversed and aimed at Trump.
That's right. They end up playing his own words back at him about
exactly right.
And old people are no good.
And there are some reasonable candidates, it seems, for the Dems if they're bold. I don't think any of the leading candidates appear to be terribly effective, and I'm not sure how bold they'll be, but there's some sort of Midwest candidates that could rally local support in the key swing states, and so it's not over if the Dems do move, and it appears today, like with Chuck Schumer kind of seemingly on board with pushing out Biden, that it's going to happen. If he's exceeded him. Made the concession today that if the doctors tell him to go, he'll go, and so obviously it's not hard to get a doctor at this point to say you're not up to it, mate.
Yeah, that's all right.
So in terms of rhetorical landscape, it shifted towards replacing Biden today, and so it ain't over till it's over. Is all I can say. But today, with Trump the clear favourite following recent events, we thought we'd look at what that means. So.
Yeah, exactly. And I think as well, the other thing I think is well worth prefacing with this is that Trump as a candidate, or not even a candidate, as a president as well, has got far fewer compunctions than any other politician potentially that I've ever seen about reversing his position completely. And yes, he has no... some people feel the urge to need to be consistent. That's not one of his
no, he doesn't
flaws.
care.
Yes.
Yeah.
Or feature. Not one of his features, let's say. Yeah. And so I guess there's some of this stuff we'll talk about where it's like, okay, this is what it looks like, but it could reverse. And so there's some of these. I think there's for me, as I'm thinking about this from an investment perspective, there's certain parts where you're like, okay, here's the sort of general thrust of what he's going to try and do, and we can invest around those themes. Here's some specific policies about maybe particular countries or whatever it is, which you don't want to make a bet on because you don't want to make an extreme bet on because that could reverse very quickly.
Yeah, and he's a bit of a messianic orator as well.
Yeah,
and so he can just drop a bombshell, of a pivot, probably without even meaning to.
Exactly, and then walk it back 3 reps later.
Either walk it back or follow it through.
Or double down on it because he's doubled down on it 4 hours later because he was like, "Oh, really? I said that? Oh, well, yeah, that seems like an all right thing to do."
Yeah, that sounds really smart.
Yeah, that's right. And so
I'll do that. So it's obviously volatile in terms of policy process.
Yeah. So I just sort of pop up on screen. This is a chart just out this, and I don't want to take this as any gospel or anything like that. It's just sort of showing there's a few things about as Trump's betting odds rise, what do markets do? And so generally speaking, it's sort of going, well, if I take the bottom left, markets sort of rally. It's equity markets sort of rally as his betting odds increase. The far right bottom corner is inflation expectations tend to fall as his betting odds increase, and so we'll talk a little bit about that. Having said that, though, the 10-year bond yield sort of is a bit weird in that it sort of rises a little bit and then starts to fall. The oil price sort of tends to fall, some of the volatility indexes, that's probably the more surprising one. And some of the volatility indexes, they sort of rise at the start with a little bit of a rise, and then they start to fall away. But I don't know how true that is. But I feel the volatility indexes is probably a good starting point in terms of saying, things are probably going to be more volatile under a Trump presidency.
Yeah. Well, no, those are not bad rules of thumb, actually, for Trump outcomes. I would say most of what we're about to discuss would fit with those patterns. So that's not a bad lead in, actually.
Yeah. The other thing I just wanted to touch on really quickly, because we last time we spoke a lot about the criminal cases. I think we don't need to worry too much about that now. Just sort of do a quick recap, though, just for anyone who's tracking in. So the hush money case, so he's found guilty. The negatives are probably done. The sentencing might have been another big thing that's probably going to get delayed by some of the Supreme Court immunity stuff. So that's probably another potential negative is, still possible he can get sentenced before the election, but there's also it's also entirely possible that there's enough delays and everything thrown into there that he doesn't get sentenced. The Mar-a-Lago documents. So the judge there has dismissed that on what most people would say are pretty spurious claims, and I think that they would suggest that she's actually
Trump appointee
campaigning for a Supreme Court seat or something herself. It's campaigning for something, and so, but I guess it's been I won't say it's fortuitous. It's been carefully designed so that if you go through the appeals process and all that type of stuff, it'll probably get put back on again, but it probably won't. It's highly unlikely to get put back on in time for the election. So it's sort of been time for dragged. I guess when the cynical view and perhaps the correct view is she dragged it out as long as possible, avoided making decisions on a whole bunch of things, then dismissed the case on relatively spurious outcomes, and hasn't left enough time for that to come out before the election, for it all to get sort of put back in before the election, and also the fact that she sort of timed her announcement of the back to the Trump convention. Basically the day of the Trump convention is when the announcement came out. Sort of all leads to that. Election interference. Georgia's going nowhere. That's bogged down. There'll be a little bit of stuff, but whatever. Election interference case in the federal. There's two views on this. One is actually they're going to have some sort of mini cases where they'll get to present all the evidence. Not going to go anywhere in terms of convictions, but they'll actually get to present all the evidence for it, which could be quite damning. And then the flip side is, though, actually some of the Supreme Court immunity decisions might mean that stuff just never gets heard. And so there's probably so forget those other sort of cases. I think the last two I want to focus in on, because there's little's likely to happen. It seems the Supreme Court's made a few decisions that's effectively running interference. Nothing's going to get decided before the election, but probably. The immunity one, though, is actually really interesting in terms of what does that mean going forward? Because effectively they've given some pretty broad-ranging immunity to presidents, and far greater than I think anyone had really contemplated before, and also as far as saying, as long as it's somewhat involved in the official acts, you can't even go back to motives as to why they're doing it. So, for example, and one of the dissenting judges sort of highlighted some of this is that it does seem that it's perfectly legal for a president to take bribes, for example, to say hold out to China and say okay, we're not going to do anything on Taiwan as long as you buy out my hotel network for 6 times its value. It doesn't appear that there's certainly enough in there that you could say that's legal, or it can't even be examined under the existing one. So it does seem as if you're worried about bribery, that there's the Supreme Court has given a lot more room for presidents to be bribed. Let's just put it that way. And so that's one of the reasons why what we're saying in terms of volatility and Trump changing positions is it may well be that there's things he comes up with and says, this is what my view is, and this is what I'm going to do, and then the interested parties all come out and back channel and pay the requisite amount, and then that's what changes the policy. And then the other one is the agency power, which is actually flown under the radar. Is that there's been a number of Supreme Court, or one or two Supreme Court decisions in particular, that have very much taken power away from agencies. And effectively what used to happen was if somewhere if there was ever any doubt about the law, so the law sort of can't determine everything, but it can say that you can't dump crap into rivers, for example, and pollute rivers, but they don't go down to say, well, what is exactly what is that? How many parts per million, and all these things like that. That's always come back to the actual agencies. So, for example, in that case, the EPA in the US, the Environmental Protection Authority, and basically courts were basically told, the precedent was that if there's doubt, then the agency is the one who decides. And so, whereas now the courts have actually taken back that power. So they've basically said, okay, well, look, if the EPA has come out and said, you've dumped 20 parts per million into this river, and so we're suing you, is that, the person can come back and say, well, I've found somebody somewhere that says 20 parts per million is perfectly safe, and just basically push it through the courts and actually have a judge be the person who actually decides, is it 20 parts or is it 100 parts or whatever it is. And so what that means is you can go shopping for the right judge, and then you're going to get these things tied up in courts forever, and maybe there's a whole bunch more Supreme Court cases. But I think it's well worth noting that in terms of neutering the power of agencies to make these decisions, you've basically put it back onto the courts or onto legislators to go and legislate exactly the number. Which basically is going to gum up the works. So what it means is you can end up with these cases where the executive is trying to do something, and the person who's affected by it can just stick it into courts and gum it up for years of appeals and all this other stuff. And so while that seems good, might have seemed good if you're a Republican trying to limit the power of the agencies because you believe government's bad. It might actually come back to bite you if Trump's trying to use a whole bunch of executive power and executive motions to actually get stuff done. Like, it could actually mean that things that he wants to do, the Supreme Court rulings actually have the effect of slowing things down. Now, he might get there in the end, but he might come out with an executive order, whatever it is, I'm going to stop this pipeline, and then have that end up in a friendly court for the person who's doing it, and make this pipeline go ahead. Probably I'm talking the wrong way around. And then it might just add 3 or 4 years to the process. He might get where he wants in the end, and might end up needing to go to the Supreme Court, but it's just going to slow things down. So well worth keeping that in mind as well. Right, so that was the criminal cases. Right, off to the tariffs and the tax cuts. I guess the real sort of meat of the matter. Dave, we've got actually. Why don't we go quickly to a quick message first?
Okay. We'll be back with the investment insights very shortly. Nucleus Wealth is an active and passive investment manager. If you like what you're hearing and want some help with your investing, we can do it for you via our active portfolios. Our tactical and core portfolios use the insights shared in this podcast to construct and manage your investment. We blend tactical portfolios to offer our combinations of international shares, Australian shares, government bonds, and cash. We vary the asset allocation with the goal of protecting your capital in times of market uncertainty. We also have active international and Australian share portfolios. These are chosen using our quality and value investment philosophy. You can find out more at nucleuswealth.com. Now back to the show.
Right. So tariffs and tax cuts. That's I guess the order of the day. So
yeah,
what are the big policies we can expect from a Trump administration?
Well, I mean, it is noteworthy that we don't really know. For starters, like, it's been pretty small target so far, more gestures than actual policy positions, but we're getting kind of indicative positions. I mean, we'll perhaps start with tariffs, because that's probably more prominent. Like, there's this idea that they'll have 60% tariffs on China. It has been out for quite a while. But overnight, I haven't seen this before, perhaps it has been mooted, but suddenly it sort of jumped to 100%, which is, classic Trump, as he grows in confidence. So some kind of monstrous tariff on China, 10% tariffs for everyone else, which could be pretty nasty for places like the European Union. But especially nasty for China. We'll come back to that. And these to some extent to be recycled, the revenue raised out of these tariffs to be recycled as tax cuts. But of course, the tariff revenue will be considerably smaller than the tax cuts. So That's more, I suppose, an optic than a reality. And the tax cuts are large. We're talking, Trump sort of revisiting and redoing what he did in the first time. We're trying to cut corporate taxes from, what are they, 21 now, 23? 21 to get them down to 15. This is classic sort of mix of populist, it's populist policy, that is using tariffs to try and endear yourself to workers who might be displaced by foreign competition, and on the other hand, you're giving a lot of the gains.
Well, all of the gains plus more.
All of the gains, certainly most of the gains to corporations.
Yeah.
And so it's very trickle-down, supply-side kind of economics.
Yeah, and the way to think about this from a tax perspective for me is that you go from an earnings perspective is you go, okay, well, so you earn $100 in pre-tax. For a company that earns $100 pre-tax, they end up with $79 post-tax at the moment. They're going to go from $100. They're going to go to 85. So you're sort of going, okay, well, it's not quite a 10% bump to your profitability. And now, not all companies pay that top rate. So there's a lot of sort of tax stuff that goes on. So there's probably somewhere between 5 and 8%, I'd say, as a broad overview on the market as to what you could get back from that. But it's also interesting insofar as at 15%, you might find there's a lot. You end up with more corporate taxes in the US rather than in other countries. So there's a lot of stuff. And the US tax system for corporations is actually relatively friendly towards letting corporations do this, where they can earn money in lower tax havens and then just not end up bringing that back to the US. And so that was a big thing you saw with a lot of companies where, especially a lot of the tech companies, where you'd see them with these massive cash balances, but also this debt as well. And you're like, why are they doing that? It's like, well, that one of them's the cash balances are sitting. If they bring the cash back to the US, then they have to pay the tax on it. And so they'd have these big cash balances sitting offshore, and then they'd be borrowing in the US in order to pay out dividends. And anyway, long story short is, it's not a complete, if you added 5 to 8% to earnings, but you might actually add a little bit more to the US corporate tax base than you think. Like, so you might not lose as much from the corporate base, because you might actually just find it's a shift from wherever, Ireland or the UK or something like that back into the US for companies. Yeah.
Well, that said, I and we'll get back to this in sort of the investment implications, but that'd be quite nasty for China. It'd be quite bad for Europe and a lot of emerging markets in terms of growth. And then, UBS was out this week saying it would halve Chinese growth, which I find quite plausible, given the composition of Chinese growth at the moment is very exports driven, and so that's a massive hit to international revenue for the S&P 500, and particularly tech, which earns 60% of its revenues offshore. And so I could see this becoming, even though you're getting the tax cut within the US, you could very easily find yourself with a bit of growth panic that backfires on the same companies.
Well, that's right. So if you added 10% to the US dollar, say, and you've got a company that's got half its earnings overseas, half in the US and half overseas, then you've just offset the whole thing.
That's right. And I mean, just harking back to those little charts at the beginning, I think where it sort of suggests you might see a bit of a backup in the bond market, as a result of tariffs and an inflationary scare, and that lifts the US dollar. But it would probably ebb away pretty quickly, I think, if you got it at all, because the growth implications for other dimensions of the global economy are really bad, and especially for commodities. So you're going to get quite a lot of deflationary or disinflationary results from these tariffs in the US coming out of everywhere else.
Mm.
So, I don't think it's a slam dunk that this is a US inflationary policy, because it could be so destructive that it ends up being the opposite.
But also as well, the one I'd highlight is in my view, well, I think we should probably share this view, David, is that the more you can spread out money, the less inequality you have. So if you make people more equal in terms of income, then you get more inflation, because poorer people rush out and spend the money really quickly, and whereas rich people, when you're going the other way, more inequality, rich people just tend to sit on it and invest it all. And so Trump's policies are generally about saying, while they might notionally be all about poor people, they tend to be more skewed to helping out rich people and corporations.
Yeah.
And so, a good example, a great example of this is responses to the pandemic, where most countries sort of went, hey, let's give all these people, and particularly poor people, these extra benefits and send checks to everyone and things like that. And boom, inflation took off everywhere. So whereas in China, they actually didn't do that. They actually said, let's try and support our companies and let's try and help companies and give them all the benefits. And you end up with deflation. And so, and I think that's just exactly that same type of thing where you go, yes, it might be, at its core, Trump will probably spend more money than the Democrats will in terms of having a bigger budget deficit and happy to have more debt. But that's traditionally inflationary. But if you're putting that into the wrong places and you're giving that away as lower tax cuts and more money for rich people and corporations, then it is likely to be disinflationary rather than inflationary.
Mm. So at this point, I should probably define what I mean by populist, because I think Trump is a classic populist, which is not the same way that most of the media defines populism. That is, Trump pretends to be for the worker, but he's not of the worker.
He doesn't pretend to be of the worker.
Sorry, he pretends to be. Well, no, that's right. So, and that's where we come to the immigration stuff. Okay, so, this is where you've got the policy bribe, if you like, for US workers, where he's going to restore stronger borders and deport a whole bunch of illegals from the US labour market. And so, he's arguing quite explicitly that this will be good for wages. And he's probably right at the margin. In fact, he's almost certainly right at the margin if he does it with enough vigour. But at the same time, he's also doing opening a new channel for immigration via international students, where we got a bit of a bait and switch going on, where anyone who graduates from a US college will get a green card. Now, there's about 1 million of those at the moment, which is a relatively small, versus the US economy, certainly in comparison to, say, Australia, where we have 600,000 and the economy is like barely 1/10 the size of the US, in fact, less. But if he does do that, he's going to get a very nasty surprise of a complete, rampant a phony college boom in the US, where you get an absolute avalanche of
he's selling a green card. I will start a college in order to sell green cards.
That's right. So as has happened in Australia, and particularly out of India, and we know all this.
Maybe there's some chancellors in Australia who will get headhunted to run these things.
Almost certainly, yes. I won't name any names, but it'll be a rich source. Yeah. So So, there are baits and switches in his agenda which are not terribly good for Labor, but at the same time, somewhat good, but anyway.
Actually, this is a really important point, though, Dave. So there's two parts.
Labor. Yeah.
So there's two parts to this that are, I think, worth highlighting. So one is, as you said, he's largely at the, while he's says he's for the common man, as he said, he's holding himself out to be for the common man, but actually most of his policies are for corporates and rich people.
Yeah.
And this immigration one, generally speaking, corporations want a lot of immigration because they've already got the best places. With everything we've seen in Australia, you've already got if I'm Coles or Woolies and I've already got all of the best places, I want more immigration so I can jam pack and get more people per store.
Yeah.
I want more immigrants because then I've got more workers to choose from and I keep the wages low and all that type of stuff. So while I'm not saying Trump is going to change his immigration stance and suddenly be pro-immigration, it does seem likely to me that build a wall, for example, that's a great policy in terms of it's a very
it's visible,
symbolic. Yeah, it's a symbol of like, this is what I'm doing. You don't actually have to do it, and you can, as I said, or you can stop all the legal immigration, as you said, and let in all these students and find that
you build a wall and a bigger airport.
Exactly, exactly. So that you're so the net effect is,
which is classic Australian policy, actually. I mean, we should give credit where it's due. Australia invented this bait and switch.
Yeah,
so
there's that part of it, but the other side of it, that was my first point. Second, but it probably still does lean towards less immigration than what you see under Biden. But that's
it would be, but. Not necessarily inflationary, I guess is the point.
Yeah,
certainly not so much that it becomes an issue anyway.
Yeah.
So
the other part, though, that's really interesting from this Trump perspective is if Trump puts in that policy, Australia suddenly has a lot of competition.
Oh yes,
and also all of a sudden, Australian
fabulous for Australia.
Exactly. This might be we've sort of been on a lot of this stuff saying, look, you've got to get international holdings. You got to have, we're running it sort of 2/3, 1/3 in terms of our international versus Aussie. Must be even more than that at the moment, given the international performance. And this whole view that, look, if there's a tech boom and Australia's not going to benefit from it, the fall of China, all that type of stuff like that. This does put a lot of thoughts into the Australian model, and particularly, so there's positives and negatives in this. There's some positive economic impacts, but the other thing is, from what we're investing in Australia, we're basically investing in the guys who are benefiting from this crush load. So the idea that Australia's full of oligopolies, they're all trying to keep as much of this as they can, and your classic, say, Transurban, for example, is yes. We're just going to rely on the fact that as we crush those cities, they all need these toll roads and they're all going to pay more. And governments are no longer building these things themselves. But this could actually change that. So while you might get some more positive Australian economic growth, it's unlikely to be the same companies that were benefiting from our existing economic growth, I guess is where I'm coming from. So there's a depending upon what actually goes on in this, there's actually a reasonable change in terms of how you look at what you're buying in Australia.
I mean, you would expect us to bastardize our visa system very quickly to compete. There'll be a race to the bottom, but head to head we'll lose, I would think. I mean, US college system is much better than our own universities. Plus, the attraction of a US green card is pretty overwhelming versus,
that was the bigger point for me is that, I think all the surveys you do, there's some people come to Australia because they want to, but there's a lot of people that come to Australia because it's like, well, I had a choice between the US, which was quite expensive and hard to get into, Canada, Australia, the UK.
Come because you can.
Yeah, that's right. I'm really trying to work into somewhere, and I know that I've got a much better chance of being able to stay in Australia.
That might be one of those wonderful moments where Australians benefit from the destruction of Canberra policy by external forces.
Well, exactly.
Which happens, regularly.
We've spoken about Chinese policies doing that for us.
We're always looking to others to look after our interests. So, I mean, but the takeout, I guess, is that I don't necessarily see the tariffs as inflationary. And I don't necessarily see the immigration stuff as inflationary.
And sorry, to define that though, long-term inflationary.
Yeah,
it'll have a short-term effect, absolutely.
Oh yeah, sure, a quick effect, but not if it triggers market panic and commodity meltdown and halves Chinese growth, and you're going to see massive asset price deflation really quick on those things, and so. that could trigger, a bond rally. In fact, with central banks, kind of looking to cut, I'd be looking for a major growth scare out of that, probably more than a bond backup. So, or both. God knows, it could be both. You could get a bond backup, that really freaks out equities, and a growth scare. Like you could get the whole caboodle. But it's risky stuff. Anyway, that's not a bad segue into this final, more radical of the sort of Trumpian policy matrix. And one of the more radical ideas is to sort of scrap the Federal Reserve, because he's about high tariffs, low taxes, and low interest rates. That's this sort of magical trinity. But I'm just sort of no on that one, because if you're going to throw another, let's say tariffs give you 1 trillion, maybe 1.5, and you're left with 3 trillion extra, kind of borrowing out of the tax cuts, and you've already got an unsustainable fiscal problem in the US, and the markets kind of freak out about the potential for inflation. And so the last thing you want to do is abolish the Federal Reserve and give away the possibility of yield curve control, which is, when, the Fed can just step in and say, well, we're going to buy bonds at this number, and they don't even do it because everyone else does it for them. And to unleash markets upon yourself when you're doing nominally such inflationary shit while ruining your own budget is pretty self-destructive behaviour.
Well, so this is, so if you go back to a country that's sort of tried elements of this, you sort of say Turkey is they didn't abolish the Federal Reserve, but he certainly put lackeys into there. But I guess the big difference is,
I'm sure Erdogan
that's a regional
is on Trump's shelf somewhere.
Yeah, that's right. That was I guess the big difference is the US has got a lot of goodwill to burn through. I suppose in terms of like whereas Turkey had built up a fair bit of goodwill, and Erdogan had been there for a long time, and eventually sucked that all out. I feel like to get through the general goodwill about the US and the strength of its currency will probably takes more than 4 years. I guess is what I'm.
Yeah, look,
unless you're really ready.
True. I'm not saying, like, we've got a thing later on about the possibility of a sort of Liz Truss moment where markets freak out about US deficits. I don't think that's likely. It's certainly not a brace case, because I think inflation's ebbing away, and so markets will go with the sort of path of least resistance. I still don't think it's a great idea to be abolishing the Fed, though.
Oh, really? Really?
Well, I mean,
anyway, we're really talking to that. I've got a question here for you, Dave, though. You're
really setting yourself up for a problem there. I mean, that said, I think a more likely outcome perhaps is him. He's said he'll allow Jay Powell to finish his tenure, and then plonk, a lackey in there. That seems to me much more plausible.
Yeah, well, and he had a couple of goes at putting lackeys, or just certainly some wackos on last time,
yeah,
and they all ended up getting knocked back. I guess this is a question of, do you end up with, so will he be better at managing that whole process, and has he managed to clear the Republican Party of dissenters a bit more, so that when he says, I'm adding 2 more people to the Federal Reserve, one of them's a Bitcoin, I'm releasing, what was the guy we locked up, the Bitcoin guy?
I can't recall.
Yeah. Anyway, we're releasing him from prison to sit on the Federal Reserve, and we've got a gold nut as well that's going to.
Well, crypto is a great one for looking at Trump volatility. Like, he was all US dollar in his first stint and hated crypto, and now he's all crypto.
Yeah. Quick question though before we go. I think this is an interesting sidebar, but I'll So Alex is asking, wouldn't such a huge tariff only destroy domestic demand in the US and prices of things that are mostly imported go through the roof?
Look, yes, that's why it's inflationary.
Short-term inflationary.
Short-term inflationary, but I mean,
but longer-term deflationary,
yeah,
that destroys your demand.
Shock. If let's take China for example, if they go 60% and China decides to respond with a devaluing yuan, and so they manage to wipe off a little bit of that, then its exporters absorb, another portion of it in margins, which they could take quite a lot of a hit on margins to persist in exporting to the US. And then, there's a large slice that's knocked out and that goes elsewhere. Like, it doesn't go to the US, it goes to another cheap jurisdiction. You have at the moment Biden, for instance, doing steel tariffs on Mexico, and that's really aimed at China. Like, China's been using Mexico as a proxy to export steel to the US since various tariffs came in earlier. And so you have this kind of whack-a-mole game as production shifts out of China into all sorts of friend-shoring activities, and the supply chains go God knows where all over the world to get into the US to get away from the tariff. And 10% tariff everywhere else is not really that severe unless, you're really slim margined. And so, or you can absorb price rises in a lot of that kind of redistribution, I guess. And so I don't, but yes, there's a hit for the US initially, but not if it comes with a tax cut, right?
Well, and then the other part is it weakens demand.
Sorry.
But I mean, we are arguing anyway that this will be a redistribution towards companies and rich people anyway, and away from poorer people. So you get your wages, bit of a wage bump because there won't be as much immigration. You'll then get hit on these tariffs, but you'll be told, look, it's just one off, and it's it'll be better for you. Just suck it up, and then so we'll end up with more deflation or more disinflation because you'll have the money ending up with the rich people and poorer people poorer.
Yeah, and if it does really smack China, I can't see why it wouldn't. And we'll come back to this in investment implications. Then, then all the entire commodity complex could get smashed. Everything from oil to iron ore and everything in between, falls 30%, and some of them more, because China's just ceases to be a growth engine at all. That's really about how they respond to Trump. If they were to respond with counter tariffs, then the $2 of exports that the US sends to China would be hurt. But then you're in a tit for tat, and you're into a negative feedback loop that could draw in others, and then you're into all sorts of growth damage, in that scenario, and that's very deflationary as well, weirdly enough. Initial inflationary hit, but offset by tax cuts and other little bits and pieces, and then just growth problem.
And let's say you're a small sort of small democracy, doesn't make anything.
So you're not talking about Australia then?
No, of course not. Small democracy in the South Pacific that doesn't actually make anything, and so you don't really have that much of a worry about tariffs because if there's a whole tariff war going on, and you're not putting up your own tariffs, but what you're seeing China devalue its currency and potentially stronger US dollar and weaker in other things, then that's a bit of a wave of more product deflation sort of coming your way.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I mean you'll have excess production being dumped everywhere. If you're not going to raise tariffs, you're going to get swamped.
Yeah, and there's an interesting thing with Australia, like on the whole electric car stuff that's going on, where everyone's trying to put these tariffs on Chinese EVs because they're trying to protect their own car industries. Is sort of that comes back to Australia about going, at some point you'd think Australia will become a bit of a dumping ground for cheap EVs because China's trying to
Yeah.
lower the prices. And so it's actually not given you've already killed your car industry. If you had a car industry, you'd be more worried about it. But given we've already killed it, it's actually not a bad position to be in.
Yeah, like I wrote a piece for News this week on what the Trump agenda was like for Australia. In the end, it was sort of net bad, largely because it'll hit China so hard. But there are actually some goods like that come out. One of them is cheaper stuff. The other one, of course, was less students and so less crush loading pressures. But that's deflation too, right?
Yeah. But there's policy, as you said, it's the policies that is being enforced on us by others that we actually like. Like you're saying, less dependency on China to just buy all our crap is like fantastic. Less students because now they're pushing off to the US rather than to Australia. A bit of deflation coming through from these products because we can't bloody manage our own housing sector and our own energy sector is like sort of
no, and he's going to take the moratorium off LNG exports or export approvals in the US. And, that's, of course, as we know, one of the most perverse mistakes Australia's ever made is shipping all its gas, East Coast gas to China. And so every time the international price goes up, we lose money.
And not shipping it off, but not making any money from it. It's fine if you want to ship it off and make a big margin out of it. That's right.
It raises all the energy costs here. So,
the lucky country, mate.
That's right. I mean, Trump's really got us in mind and to some extent. But I mean, I think in the end, the net outcome is bad just because China would get hit so hard. But of course, we'll come back to that because what would China do in response? So first, before we do that, you wanted to quickly run through the possibility of Democrats.
No, that's all. Let's skip that. Let's jump to the geopolitics. Yeah.
Okay. So geopolitics plays a big role here as well in terms of all of these issues we're discussing. Probably energy is the big one. One of the big ones. There are two big ones. So it seems pretty clear that China will just reduce support for Ukraine and hand it over to Putin, his friend, unless the Europeans step up, which they would.
Yeah,
of course.
But you would probably add whatever it is, whatever length you thought this war was going to go on. You probably just double it or triple it without the US support.
Yes, that's right. I think Trump is very friendly with the Saudis, which is an odd one, although probably part of his energy play and deflation, looking for deflation.
Yes, and a cynic, though, would say this is the benefit of bribery as well.
Oh, of course. Yeah, that goes without saying in all of these. So, and the Saudis, I think it was the Saudis that shifted all of their diplomatic corps into Trump hotels.
Yes.
In these first.
Yeah, they basically booked it all out. Booked out
every So that's a lead on what everyone should be doing.
But
well,
I think that's the one I'm
doing, and it's not enough. You need to be doing more than that. You need to be
and I think that was the one I was talking to you about, is saying the most interesting geopolitical one for me in terms of this China is saying Trump last time was basically saying, okay, I need a boogeyman. The boogeyman's going to be a mixture of those liberal Democrats, trying to push woke agenda upon everyone, and China trying to steal all our jobs. And that's our big boogeyman. And actually, don't worry about North Korea and Iran and Iran. I suppose he did, but don't worry about North Korea and Russia. They're no longer the bad guys. And the question is, if he got bribed enough by China, would he flip that? And could he get away? Could he get away with just not having an international, enemy, so to speak, other than maybe Iran, which is sort of a bit of a nothing in the whole scheme?
Well, as we saw in Trump 1, he bashed China with tariffs and then did a deal negotiating back from those tariffs, and that's his methodology: go in hard and negotiate down. Yeah, and so I think there's every chance that if Beijing was crazy enough to go after Taiwan, that Trump would let him have it.
For the right price.
For the right price, yes. But at the same time, I've long argued that's not a war worth fighting anyway, because the risks are too high and it's a civil war, really. In truth. so that's not necessarily a bad thing. I would hope that Trump would use it as a way of marginalising China economically, and I don't. There seems to be a reasonable prospect of that. I can't see why he wouldn't go ahead with that. Like you got to use Taiwan as a way of ending the Chinese empire, right? I think, and by that I mean, trade sanctions, kicking them out of the SWIFT system, using your reserve currency to beat them to death, just killing them, killing capital flows off, like the whole 9 yards, and just let China isolate itself with Taiwan. I mean, they're no longer a threat at that point. But I don't know whether he'd do that. Certainly, it makes the prospect of a Taiwanese accession. Taiwanese annexation more likely, I guess. Hard to say. Like, there's no.
The thing is, they're probably going to fight the tariffs first.
That's right.
First, they've got to bribe them enough to get rid of the tariffs. And then
this is where it comes up. What I've got here at the end here, which I've been gesturing at throughout this, and could this culminate in a grand deal between the US and China, like a Plaza Accord 2.0, where the Chinese agree to just take the tariffs, not drop their currency, back right off from stealing US jobs. I mean, back right off exports to the US. And in return, they get what they get, which might be Taiwan or something else. So, some kind of outcome like that doesn't seem impossible. That was sort of the pattern of Trump 1. And the other thing I would note is, obviously he loves a good dictator. He hates any democratic leader. And so, there's an irony or a paradox in this where the US withdraws from a lot of wars, and that would make you think there'll be less war, but it'll actually mean more war.
Just not with the US involved.
Yeah, just not with the US, because every tin pot dictator will be emboldened and what have you. So, in general, I would say, bad for energy, geopolitics, for in terms of what Trump's kind of looking to do, and then goodness me, what happens in the Sino-US relationship is epic, potentially.
Yes. But I think though the message though as well as what we've just spoken about is a range of a whole different, anything from they're now the enemy and they're devaluing their currency and there was this huge trade war versus we come to an agreement and everyone agrees that Taiwan gets whatever.
Yeah,
something like there's this the number of outcomes is the range of outcomes is much wider than under a democratic.
So macro and investment implications. We do see Trump administration as higher inflation than a Democratic administration, but not necessarily high inflation or higher inflation from where we are today. So, tariffs and any impact on wages from immigration are enough to boost inflation versus the counterfactual of Democrats, but versus, actually being an inflationary shock that is sustained in any meaningful way, maybe not. Excuse me. The real sort of known unknown here is China and the damage that these tariffs would do there. I think that's quite severe. And I think that's given the state of China. I mean, it's already terrible. In truth, I don't think it's hardly growing at all. Like if you actually calculate its GDP properly, it would be barely growing with its property bust. Would China respond to a Trump tariff attack? Certainly by dropping the yuan, I would think, but would it do some serious bazooka domestic demand stimulus? which has always been property. I don't know. What do you think? I really don't know.
It's the range of outcomes. I mean, look, I guess I would say from this is that what we've seen is that when things get bad enough in China, they will go back to the property, pull that property lever again. So they did it during the pandemic.
This is bad enough.
And that may well be bad enough that they pull the lever again.
So they would. They probably would. And that may not be a bad thing for China, to be perfectly honest, because right now they're pursuing a set of policies that are just downright weird. Right? Trying to manage a debt deflation with, like, for instance, the PBOC has spent the last few weeks trying to lift interest rates by borrowing and selling bonds, to avoid a bond bubble. And I'm like, look, you've got intensifying and entrenching deflation in everything, and you're worried about a bond bubble. I mean, you're about 20 years ahead of where you should be. You got to fix your deflation. And so if it resulted in a big devaluation, falling interest rates in China, and it might actually be doing them, and a domestic stimulus of some sort, it might actually be doing them a favour to avoid a kind of Japanese outcome. But all that's kind of by the by. I would expect anyway that the tariffs would trigger a big growth scare for China. So I've been writing a little bit about a kind of China crisis 2025 if Trump gets in. I think initially that's where it would be. They probably would buckle on property, but it would take time, I think, for them to turn that around this time.
And they might not be able to.
Like they probably could really go after it.
But they're going to have to. It's not. Get the dollar up to 11.
It won't be easy. No, it won't. No. And it might be. It might be just that it stops it from going where it's going and stabilizes it and takes ages. And so, oil and commodities bear market coming out of Trump. Europe hurt as well. Global growth hurt. EM's hurt. Stronger US dollar for a while at least as markets digest the idea of inflation, but quickly run over by oil and commodities bear market or big deflationary shock coming out of that.
Just to touch quickly on that oil. So the reason for saying oil bear market is, despite sort of Trump saying he's going to open it up and drill baby drill and all this type of stuff like that, it's effectively the worst possible outcome for a lot of the oil market in that you're going to have a growth concern globally, which is going to take away from demand. Meanwhile, rapidly him doing everything he can to expand supply. So,
yes, and making friends with Putin.
And
making friends with
Russian oil coming back on,
and the Saudis, the US kind of trying to find ends to two wars that are pissing those two autocracies off, and looking for some oil payback.
Yes, absolutely. Let's get to the investment implications, but I just want to jump into another sales message.
We'll be back again shortly. If you like what you're hearing but want a low-cost passive option, Nucleus Wealth is the first to offer passive direct indexing in Australia. The first generation of passive investing was index funds. The next gen was ETFs. Now direct indexing is here with significantly more customization and control. The benefit of direct indexing is you can add or subtract investment themes, and we have almost 100 different options to choose from. For example, you could buy an international share direct index portfolio that excludes fossil fuels and arms manufacturers and has a tilt towards cybersecurity and cloud computing. Alternatively, you could buy a portfolio with no screens and an extra exposure to nuclear power and defense contractors. You can find out more at nucleuswealth.com. Now back to the show.
Right, so back to the last thing, the Liz Truss moment. What do you mean by that?
I mean, this is sort of floating around in the ether, the idea that we might find ourselves finally at some reckoning for US fiscal excesses under Trump, and like Liz Truss, Trump's this sort of mad supply sider.
So let's just define a little bit what happened with Truss. Is basically Truss came in, tax cuts, unfunded tax cuts,
Yeah,
right at the deficit.
Bugger the deficit.
Yeah, and then markets basically panicked. Interest
Yep.
rates went up, and they had to reverse everything. So markets effectively,
basically, the bond market destroyed the government inside of 2 weeks, right? But it was a very different environment. Like, it was in the middle of the, when the global inflation panic was underway, and so it was a really stupid idea to do at that point in time. I would argue a stupid idea to do any time, but certainly at that moment. Now, I don't think that's the context in which Trump would find itself over any period other than the very short term. And so you might get a bit of a pop in yields initially, which is what we see in those charts in the lead-in, just as markets worry about inflation. But I just think that the growth implications pretty quickly would become apparent, and other deflationary forces would overtake it pretty quickly. And so you're not really going to get a Liz Truss moment if everyone's worried about weak growth and deflation. It'll just be another can kick for US fiscal deficits. So,
well, and the other thing I'd say is,
but of course, if I'm wrong, look, here's a scenario. So, Trump does all of his stuff, and China just goes all in on a stimulus, drives commodity prices crazy with a huge new building boom, and then you've got the circumstances in which you get a bond backup that really hammers the Trump agenda. Possible, but it seems to me difficult for China to stimulate that hard.
Yeah, but I think as well there is an element of Trump's. Whereas Truss came in and sort of went, here is our whole agenda that you've never really heard about. You didn't ever really voted for us, and here it all is, in suddenly encapsulated in a very short period of time, and everyone sort of freaked out. I think from the Trump perspective, he's actually had time to, so people know roughly what he's going to do, and so it's unlikely to be as much of a shock in a short period of time. And if he's incrementally putting these out and markets are starting to freak out on it, I sort of feel like as we said before, he doesn't really have a firm position on this. If he had an idea and this is what happens, and all of a sudden it seems as if markets are worried about it, he could very easily reverse it without before it gets too bad, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
It's one thing to come out and say, here's something you've never heard of, all delivered suddenly in a very short period of time. That's what freaks markets out usually. And then the whole, we're not changing anything until
if you're at full on tax cuts, tariffs, and abolish the Federal Reserve, and China chimes in with stimulus, then yeah.
But that's the abolishing Federal Reserve state, whereas that's probably a little way away yet.
Yeah, it is. It'd probably take that.
And I would say that's treated as something that certainly, I think a lot of Republicans, probably rightly in certainly some ways, is they'll take Trump's rhetoric and they'll say, well, yeah, he's just being, he's being over the top for the sake of making a point. He's not actually going to do whatever it is that that they're. I think that's certainly.
He's also talking about making Jamie Dimon Treasury Secretary.
Yeah.
That dude owns the Federal Reserve.
Yes.
Like, he's not going to abolish the Federal Reserve. Like the New York banks own it. Like they're not going to scrap it. So despite a lot of the rhetoric about the deep state and things, and the fact that a lot of the people behind Trump are much more crazy than even the first time round. He will probably be constrained in terms of actual policy making, and I would point to the first round. Trump won when he did all of his China tariffs and really upset the stock market. he did what we're talking about. He backflipped like you wouldn't believe.
Yeah.
And so the stock market plays a role here as well. Like if you do get this big growth shock coming out of tariffs, then he'll be renegotiating.
Exactly. Yeah. Excellent. That's probably a as good a place as any to leave this, unless you've got any other final thoughts, Dave.
No. It's just what can you say? It's crazy old country. I love the US, but it's crazy town.
Yeah. So I think the main thing, the final thing I'd like to sort of just leave on the investment agenda is, look, a Trump appointment as president greatly increases the range of possible outcomes. I think I'd go back to what we'd said as well about in recent times about such a poor Biden performance, and coupled with this increases the odds that they switch horses. And that increases the volatility as well, in terms of saying, well, when they switch horses, maybe they strike upon somebody that actually, Trump gets on straight away, and all of a sudden has got a bunch of great lines and just destroys them. Or maybe they end up with somebody who's ends up being great. We've finally got somebody who isn't 80 and becomes you end up getting a Democratic sweep in the opposite direction. So I just think the range of outcomes at the moment is so wide that
right.
Being
what's his running mate's name?
JD Vance,
yeah. Now he's obviously trying to offset his age a little there.
Yeah.
But if you did the reverse as a Dems, you got a young president and a more steady hand vice kind of thing. Yeah. I mean, it could electrify the electorate if you got the right person.
Yeah, that's right. So you just but the net effect, as we've just said, things could be, anything can happen is basically, but far more than say 3 or 4 weeks ago. It was like, this is where things are going to go. We've got two guys facing off. One's in just being convicted of of all these felonies, and is probably going to be looking at jail sentences and all that type of stuff like that. To all of a sudden, it's like, no, we have a hero rising from the blood of his, an assassination attempt, and a Biden showing himself to be, older than many had thought. So.
I mean, I guess I would just close on one scary thought. I don't want people to go away on feeling too hopeful. Like, what if Trump does get the sweep, and the loons that occupy his circle really go after democracy? That is a fear. Not just revenge for anybody that's ever crossed him before, but he's had an assassination attempt. I mean, the Secret Service is discredited. Does he start? Does he get in and build his own Secret Service? His own private Secret Service, does he start to build out his own private army?
Yeah. Well, and having said that, this is your I hesitate to use the word Hitler, but the idea is you just need this type of event, which is what an assassination attempt on Hitler, and now I can declare martial law. Let's take let's suspend these things, and all of a sudden take a lot more power because of whatever event that's just happened. So there's obviously lots of terrible ones of that.
I still have a lot of regard for US institutions in terms of being able to hold it together, but a second Trump presidency is going to really challenge that. And
I think the Supreme Court's shown that there's a number of factors it is willing to basically say presidents are immune from all this stuff. And
that's right. I mean, he's wrecked the Supreme Court, basically. Let's call it what it is. It's biased now. And so, what does he do? What does he wreck next? What does he turn Trumpian next?
Yeah. Anyway, that's a longer problem, and I think as well there's also, I don't want to say this is a putting off till tomorrow, but I do think there's an element of saying what do you genuinely think is going to happen in the first couple of years, and what that process is going to look like, and then I think that the real dangers to democracy are around year 4, when it's like, okay, well, if he doesn't want to go, what is he going to do now?
Well, he hasn't want to. He isn't going to want to go.
No, exactly. That's I guess not that I want to say that's a tomorrow problem, but it feels like a tomorrow problem to me from a.
Well, as a narcissist, he can only get bigger, right? So, I mean, Elon Musk needs to fly him out to be king of Mars, or and it's something big.
Okay, it's enough for an afternoon here. Thanks. You can grab all our stuff. Thanks, Dave, for tuning in on this, and thanks everyone else for tuning in, and thanks, Dave, for your comments. Just noting, you can grab us on all these different social medias. You can see on your screen all major and minor podcasts, 12:30 Thursdays. If you've got any questions, drop them in. Thanks, everyone, and we will see you next week.